From the moment I met her in the cramped hallways of our college, Lydia became the axis around which my world revolved. She wasn't just beautiful, though she had this rare magnetism that made people turn their heads when she entered a room. She was also sharp, funny, and unapologetically herself. Back then, I was the quiet guy, the one who blended into the background, but Lydia noticed me. And that was all it took. For 8 years, we were inseparable, though always as friends. She dated a few people, and so did I, but no one measured up to the connection we had. I spent so many nights on the phone with her, sharing secrets, laughing until my sides hurt, and occasionally venturing into conversations that made me hope for more. She was my first call for advice, my partner for late-night study sessions, and the person who could calm my storms with just a few words. But life is a way of making us wait for the things we want most. It wasn't until 2 years ago, long after college, that Lydia and I finally became more than friends. It felt like a dream. After years of secretly yearning for her, she was finally mine. And what we had wasn't just good, it was everything. Our relationship felt easy in the best way, like an extension of the friendship we'd already perfected. At least that's how I chose to see it. The first year of our relationship was bliss. I showered her with affection, not because I felt I had to, but because I wanted to. She reciprocated in ways that made me feel secure, like sneaking handwritten notes into my bag or planning surprise dates. We talked about everything. Our future, the kids we'd have someday, the home we'd build together. She made me believe in forever. It wasn't until Christmas of the second year that cracks began to show. Lydia was out with her friends that night, celebrating at a local pub, while I spent time with my family. I stayed up late waiting for her call, my mind flickering between excitement to hear about her night and an unease I couldn't place. When she finally called, it was nearly 1 in the morning. Her voice was cheerful, slightly slurred from the drinks, and I stayed on the line with her as she walked home. She didn't mention much about the night, just her usual chatter, and we hung up around dawn. A week later, something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the odd way she avoided specifics about that night, or the way she clutched her phone a little tighter when I walked into the room. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but a small voice in my head told me to look closer. So I did. While she slept, I scrolled through her phone, knowing it was a breach of trust, but feeling like I didn't have a choice. And there it was, messages with a man I'd never heard of, laced with teasing comments and casual flirtation. It wasn't damning, but it was enough to send my mind spiraling. When I confronted her, she broke down. She insisted nothing serious had happened, that he'd tried to kiss her, but she'd turned him down. She apologized, begged me to forgive her, and promised she'd never let it happen again. And I believed her. I wanted to believe her. She was Lydia, my best friend, and the woman I'd always dreamed of being with. If I couldn't trust her, who could I trust? For months after that, I tried to push the incident out of my mind, but the paranoia lingered. It wasn't something I could just shake off. I began checking her phone more frequently, convincing myself it was for my own peace of mind. She caught me once, and instead of exploding with anger, she changed her passcode. She framed it as a way to help me trust her again, but it felt more like a wall going up between us. As the months passed, I buried my doubts and focused on the good things. Lydia was still the woman who made me laugh like no one else, who supported me when work was overwhelming, who shared my vision for the future. We celebrated our second anniversary in November, and I gave her a promise ring during a romantic weekend getaway. It felt like a new chapter, a commitment to move past our struggles and build something lasting. But then there was her workplace. Lydia had started a new job about a year earlier, and from the very beginning, she'd mentioned a coworker named Alex. At first, she didn't have anything good to say about him. He was arrogant, rude, and someone she generally avoided. I didn't think much of it until, months later, she casually mentioned they'd exchanged numbers for work purposes. It caught me off guard, especially since she'd initially acted like she could barely stand him. Over time, her mentions of Alex became less hostile. She'd talk about something funny he said during a meeting or an inside joke they shared. I wanted to feel secure, to trust that Lydia wouldn't cross any lines, but a nagging voice in my head whispered otherwise. I tried to silence it, chalking it up to my paranoia and past experiences. I told myself she'd learned from the Christmas incident, that she'd never do anything to jeopardize what we had. Still, the unease grew. Lydia started guarding her phone more closely again, and I couldn't help but notice the way her face lit up when a notification came in. It was subtle, but to me it was glaring. I tried to ignore it, to push away the doubts gnawing at me, but they refused to be silenced. I wanted to trust her. I needed to trust her. But deep down, I was terrified of what I might find if I dug any deeper. In the weeks following our anniversary, things with Lydia felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. On the surface, everything seemed normal. We still laughed together, went on dates, and shared our plans for the future. But underneath, there was a tension I couldn't shake. It was in the way she'd sometimes glance at her phone and smile before quickly putting it away, or how she suddenly seemed more protective of her time after work. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. After all, we'd come so far. Lydia had promised she'd never let something like the Christmas incident happen again. And for a while, I believed her. But the small cracks in my confidence began to widen as my paranoia crept back in. I hated the feeling, the way it consumed my thoughts and made me question everything. It felt like being trapped in my own mind, constantly searching for clues that might not even exist. Then came Friday the 22nd. It had been a long week, and I'd spent most of the evening working late. When I came home, Lydia greeted me with a warmth that immediately put me at ease. She was in one of her clingy moods, the kind where she'd wrap herself around me and pull me to the couch. That night, she seemed especially eager, her kisses a little hungrier, her touch a little more insistent. We ended up in bed, and for a brief moment, all my doubts melted away. It felt like the connection we'd had in the beginning, the kind that made everything else disappear. But the next morning, the unease was back. Something about her behavior the night before didn't sit right. I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was how overly affectionate she'd been, almost as if she was trying to prove something. Or maybe it was just my paranoia rearing its ugly head again. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That Sunday, the tension finally got the better of me. Lydia had stepped out to run some errands, and I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at her phone on the coffee table. She'd left it behind, which wasn't like her. Normally, it was glued to her side. I knew I shouldn't look. We'd had countless fights about trust and boundaries, and I'd promised to work on my paranoia. But the urge was too strong. Before I knew it, I was unlocking her phone. At first, there was nothing. Her texts were mostly from friends, her social media filled with the usual posts and photos. But then I saw his name, Alex. My stomach dropped as I clicked on the thread. It started innocently enough. Work-related messages, casual jokes. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. His messages were flirtatious, hers playful in return. My chest tightened as I read them, each one a knife to my gut. Then I saw the photos. They weren't explicit, but they were enough to confirm what I already feared. Lydia had sent him pictures of herself, nothing I hadn't seen before, but things that felt intimate in the context of their conversation. His replies made it clear how much he enjoyed them, and her responses were just as suggestive. The messages confirmed that Friday night wasn't just another workday for Lydia. She'd been texting Alex while I was at work, sending him pictures and telling him things she should have been saying to me. And then, when I came home, she'd used that same energy with me, as if nothing had happened. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I put the phone back on the table, my mind racing. This wasn't the first time Lydia had crossed a line, but it felt worse somehow. Maybe because it wasn't just flirting this time. It was calculated, hidden, deliberate. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway. When she came home, I confronted her immediately. I couldn't hold it in, the anger and hurt spilling out before I even had time to think. Lydia didn't deny it. She broke down, tears streaming down her face as she apologized over and over. She admitted everything, saying she knew she'd messed up, that she hadn't meant for it to go that far. She begged me to forgive her, swearing she'd cut him off and do whatever it took to fix things. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the good memories and the future we'd planned together. But another part of me, the part that had seen this pattern before, knew better. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Lydia was the woman I'd always dreamed of being with. But now, all I could see were the cracks in the foundation we'd built. That night, she slept on the couch while I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything I'd read, every message and photo, every lie she'd told me. I wanted to believe she could change, that this could somehow be fixed. But deep down, I knew the truth. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. And without trust, what do we really have? I couldn't sleep after what I found on her phone. My mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying everything I'd read, the messages, the photos, the plans they'd made while I was at work. It wasn't just flirting or a stupid mistake. It was deliberate, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. And then she came to me that same night and acted like nothing had happened. We had sex, and now I can't even think about it without feeling disgusted. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together. How did we even get here? I had been so careful about trusting her after what happened at Christmas 2 years ago. I told myself she'd learned her lesson, that it was a one-time thing. She cried so much back then, swore she would never let me down again. And like an idiot, I believed her. I wanted to believe her because, deep down, I was terrified of losing her. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong I'd been. This wasn't the first time she'd crossed a line, and it clearly wasn't going to be the last. Every paranoid thought I'd had, every gut feeling I'd tried to ignore, turned out to be right. She wasn't just breaking my trust. She was shattering it over and over again. When she woke up the next morning, I couldn't even look at her. She stayed quiet, probably knowing there was nothing she could say to fix this. I went for a walk to clear my head, but all I could think about was how I was supposed to move forward. She was my best friend for 10 years, the woman I'd dreamed about being with for so long. And now, I didn't even know who she was anymore. The day dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I kept thinking about Alex, the guy she swore she didn't like when she first mentioned him. I remember how she made fun of him, said he was annoying and rude. Then, somehow, he became someone she was texting late at night, someone she was sending photos to, someone she couldn't seem to cut off no matter how many promises she made. I tried to convince myself it wasn't that bad. Maybe it was just messages, just pictures. But I knew better. People don't send texts like that unless there's more to the story. I started replaying every little thing she'd said or done over the past year. The time she stayed late at work, the way she guarded her phone, the time she seemed distant but brushed it off as being tired. It all started adding up, and I hated myself for not seeing it sooner. I wanted to confront her again, to get the truth out of her. But what would it even change? I'd already seen enough to know she had lied, and I wasn't sure I could handle hearing any more. The truth wouldn't make it hurt less. If anything, it would make it worse. That night, she stayed on the couch again. I lay in bed, staring at the empty space next to me, the space that had been hers for the past 2 years. It felt like I was mourning something that wasn't even dead yet. She was still here, technically, but the version of her I fell in love with was long gone. I kept thinking about what I told her after the Christmas incident, that if anything like this happened again, it would be over. I meant it at the time, but now that I was staring down the barrel of that decision, I felt paralyzed. Leaving her meant losing everything we'd built together, all the memories, all the plans. I didn't know if I could do it, but staying felt impossible too. How could I ever trust her again? How could I ever believe a single word she said? The next morning, I found myself scrolling through her social media while she was out. It felt pathetic, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see if there were more clues, more signs I'd missed. Every time I saw her smiling in a photo or joking with friends in the comments, it made my stomach turn. She looked so normal, so happy, like she wasn't hiding anything. But I knew better now. When she came back, I barely said a word to her. She tried to talk to me, saying she wanted to make things right, that she'd cut Alex off for good this time. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to believe her. She'd said the same thing before, and look where that got us. That night, I saw a notification pop up on her phone while she was in the shower. It was from Alex. She'd promised to block him, but clearly, that was just another lie. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. It wasn't even the content of the message that got to me. It was the fact that she couldn't even follow through on something as simple as cutting him off. I knew then that this wasn't going to get better. It didn't matter how much she apologized or how many promises she made. She had shown me who she really was, and I couldn't keep pretending she was someone else. I spent the rest of the night pacing the living room while she slept on the couch. My head was a mess, torn between the love I still felt for her and the reality of what she'd done. She was the woman I'd dreamed about for so long, the person I thought I'd spend my life with. But dreams don't erase betrayal. They don't fix broken trust. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, stuck in a cycle of lies and hurt. Whether it was her or me, someone had to walk away. The morning after Alex's notification popped up on her phone, I knew something inside me had shifted. For weeks, I'd been trapped in this cycle of anger, doubt, and heartbreak. But now, there was something else, a sense of clarity. I couldn't live like this anymore. I wouldn't. The weight of her betrayal still crushed me. But for the first time, I felt the smallest spark of resolve. If Lydia couldn't respect me, then I would respect myself. That day, I went about my routine as if nothing was wrong, but inside, I was already planning my next steps. I couldn't rush into anything. I'd made that mistake before. This time, I needed to approach things deliberately, methodically. Lydia had spent years weaving her web of lies, and untangling myself from it would take time. But I was determined. No matter how much it hurt, I would find my way out. The first thing I did was begin reclaiming my space. Lydia's things were everywhere in our home, a constant reminder of what we'd shared and what she'd destroyed. Slowly, I started boxing up the things I knew I wouldn't want to see when she was gone. It was small, almost symbolic, but it gave me a sense of control, however fleeting. After work, I spent hours researching how to move forward. I read articles about toxic relationships, listened to podcasts about overcoming betrayal, and even reached out to a close friend I trusted for advice. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't ready to expose the full mess yet, but I shared enough for them to understand that I was struggling. They told me what I already knew. Walking away wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary. The next step was taking a hard look at our shared life. Lydia and I had intertwined so much. Our finances, our routines, even our social circles. Cutting her out wasn't as simple as just ending the relationship. I'd have to untangle every piece of the life we'd built together. But the thought didn't scare me as much as it had before. If anything, it gave me purpose. I started small, reviewing our accounts and ensuring my own financial security. I opened a new bank account, redirecting my paycheck to ensure she couldn't touch it if things went south. I knew it seemed drastic, but after everything I'd learned about her duplicity, I wasn't willing to take any risks. Lydia, for her part, seemed to sense the change in me. She wasn't oblivious. She could tell I was pulling away, even if I hadn't said it outright. She tried harder in her own way, cooking my favorite meals, leaving me little notes like she used to. But the gestures felt hollow now. I couldn't see them as acts of love, only as attempts to patch up a sinking ship. When she wasn't trying to win me back, she was quiet, almost withdrawn. I caught her staring at me sometimes, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, guilt, maybe, or fear. But even her silence wasn't enough to sway me anymore. I was done letting her control the narrative. I started spending more time outside the house, finding reasons to stay late at work or catch up with old friends. It wasn't about avoiding her. It was about rebuilding myself, piece by piece. I realized how much of myself I had given to her over the years, how I'd let her take parts of me I couldn't afford to lose. Now I was determined to reclaim those parts, no matter how long it took. One night, as Lydia slept on the couch, I sat in bed scrolling through old photos of us. It was something I hadn't done in weeks, and as I flipped through image after image of happier times, I felt an odd sense of detachment. These moments, these smiles, they felt like they belonged to a different version of me. Someone more naive, more hopeful, someone who hadn't yet learned the weight of betrayal. I realized then that the love I had for Lydia wasn't enough to save us. Love alone couldn't fix broken trust, couldn't erase the lies, couldn't undo the damage she'd done. For so long, I had clung to the idea of her, the dream of who she could be, rather than accepting the reality of who she was. Letting go wouldn't just mean losing her. It would mean losing the future I had imagined for us. But I was finally ready to face that. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. I made a list of everything I needed to do, practical steps to prepare for the end of our relationship. It started with logistics, sorting out our lease, figuring out what belonged to whom, and ensuring I had a solid exit strategy. Then came the emotional work, building a support system, setting boundaries, and focusing on my own healing. I started with the lease. I knew Lydia wouldn't leave voluntarily, so I contacted our landlord to discuss my options. It turned out I could transfer the lease to her name if she agreed, which would allow me to walk away clean. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. Next, I reached out to a therapist. I hadn't been back to therapy since before Lydia and I started dating, but I knew it was time. I needed someone to help me process everything, to guide me through the complicated emotions that came with leaving someone you once loved. The first session wasn't easy, but it was a step in the right direction. One evening, as I packed another box of Lydia's things, she walked into the room. For a moment, she just stood there, watching me. I could feel her eyes on me, heavy with questions, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She knew. It was in that moment that I realized I was no longer afraid of losing her. The thought still hurt, but it didn't paralyze me anymore. For the first time, I felt like I was in control. Not of her, not of the situation, but of myself. And that was enough. The moment I decided to leave Lydia, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The ache in my chest was still there, but it was different now, less suffocating, more bearable. It wasn't the pain of indecision anymore. It was the pain of acceptance, of knowing that some things can't be repaired, no matter how much you want them to be. I spent the next few days quietly finalizing everything. I contacted our landlord to confirm the lease transfer, packed the last of my belongings, and arranged to stay with a close friend until I found a new place. Each step felt like closing a door behind me, shutting out the chaos and confusion that had consumed me for so long. Lydia noticed, of course. She wasn't oblivious. She asked questions, first gently, then more urgently, about what I was doing and why I was so distant. But I didn't give her the answers she wanted. I couldn't. She would have turned them into a debate, another way to try to convince me to stay. I wasn't interested in arguments or justifications anymore. I was past that. The night before I planned to leave, Lydia confronted me. She must have sensed it was coming, and for once, there were no tears or dramatic gestures. She just stood there, staring at me as if trying to figure out how we'd gotten here. I could see the weight of her guilt, the way it pressed on her shoulders, but it didn't move me anymore. I had carried that burden for too long. It was hers to bear now. The morning I left was quiet. I woke up early, packed the last of my things, and left a letter on the kitchen table. It wasn't long, just a few lines explaining that I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay, that I needed to take care of myself. I didn't blame her outright, but I didn't absolve her either. It wasn't my responsibility to make her feel better about what she'd done. As I walked out the door, I half expected her to stop me, to say something, anything, to try to change my mind. But the house was silent. She didn't wake up, or maybe she chose not to. Either way, it didn't matter. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally putting myself first. Driving away felt surreal. I had spent so much time tied to Lydia, her happiness, her promises, her betrayals, that leaving felt like cutting off a part of myself. But as the miles between us grew, so did my sense of relief. The world felt bigger somehow, full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider while I was with her. The first few weeks were hard. As much as I knew I'd made the right decision, there were moments when the grief hit me like a wave. I'd think about the good times we'd had, the plans we'd made, and for a fleeting moment, I'd wonder if I'd given up too soon. But then I'd remember the messages, the photos, the lies. I'd remember how it felt to question everything, to constantly wonder if I was enough for her. And that was enough to keep me moving forward. Lydia tried to reach out a few times, sending messages that ranged from apologetic to angry. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Talking to her would have only reopened wounds that were just beginning to heal. I needed space to rebuild myself, to figure out who I was outside of our relationship. I threw myself into therapy, work, and reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from during my time with Lydia. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, someone I hadn't seen in years. Months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Lydia and Alex had started dating officially. The news didn't sting the way I thought it would. If anything, it confirmed what I already knew. She had made her choices, and they had nothing to do with me. She wasn't the person I thought she was, and that was okay. I didn't need her to be. I focused on my own life, setting goals that didn't revolve around someone else. I traveled more, picked up old hobbies, and even started dating again when I felt ready. It wasn't about replacing Lydia. It was about rediscovering what it meant to be happy on my own. One day, while going through some old boxes, I found the promise ring I'd given Lydia on our anniversary. I held it in my hand for a moment, thinking about all the promises we'd made to each other and how easily they'd been broken. Then I put it back in the box and closed it. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just a memory. Looking back, I can see now that leaving Lydia was the best decision I ever made. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it taught me something important. Love isn't enough. Trust, respect, and honesty are just as crucial. And without them, love is just a word. I don't hate Lydia. I don't even blame her anymore. She made her choices, and I made mine. And while I'll always wish things had turned out differently, I'm grateful for the lessons her betrayal taught me. It showed me what I deserve, what I won't settle for, and how strong I can be when I need to be. For the first time in a long time, I feel free. Free to move forward, to build a life that makes me proud, and to love again when the time is right. And that's exactly what I intend to do.